Radio with Phil Dobby. What's really going on?
Yes, hello there. It is Balls Radio, another exciting, scintillating episode of the podcast, admired and revered by a very small number of people, but growing people. They are growing. They're significantly taller than they were last week. I'm Phil Dobby, and if you're listening to this on iTunes, on the podcast, then please go to phildobby.com because it's pretty exciting. We're using this new format called video with the program this week, so you can actually see me as well as listen to me. How exciting can that be? phildobby.com is the place to go and see that. Now, the reason why I wanted to do that this week in particular is because we're going to talk numbers, and it's always difficult to talk numbers without showing some scintillating graphs to try and support it. And the reason why I wanted to do that was because of this infuriating debate that we have in Australia, and have had, I think, for 100 years or so. Not that I'm counting, but the whole question about migration in this country. In particular, the story which is in the Telegraph today, don't know if you can see that, I'll hold it up, twice the chance of asylum. Now, this is one of those stories where it shows you can do a great deal with numbers, because basically what they're doing is alluding to the fact that refugees who seek asylum in Australia versus those who manage to happen upon the United Kingdom for some peculiar reason are more than twice as likely to get accepted here. So the inference from this article and from a lot of people is that basically we're a soft touch when it comes to migrants. But of course it could be the fact that the people who come here are more deserving. And if those same people went to the UK, then twice as many of them would be accepted over there. But perhaps they're getting a different type of refugee than we are here. And this is why I wanted to show this in graph form. Have a look at some of these.
Balls Radio.
This first graph shows the number of asylum applications for some countries around the world. And straight away you can see that this insurmountable problem for Australia, this unique issue that we face in this part of the world, isn't that unique after all. In terms of the number of asylum applications, it's a far bigger number in countries like the United States and Germany and the UK. In the first 6 months, these figures represent the number of asylum applications in the first 6 months of 2011, not over the entire year. We haven't got the statistics through yet for the second half of the year, but in the first half, 5,000 applications for Australia versus 36,370 applications for the United States. So you can see there is a big difference here. And when we look at it in relation to the size of the population of these countries, we find it's pretty similar. For example, in Australia, the number of asylum seeker applications in the first 6 months of last year, as a proportion of the entire population, is 0.022%. In other words, there were 2 asylum applications for every 10,000 people in the country. Now, we extrapolate that and assume it continues at the same rate for the second half of last year, then that's 4 applications for every 10,000 people in the country. Now, that doesn't seem like a big issue, does it? Unless, of course, as we keep on getting told, the issue is getting worse and we're getting more and more asylum seekers because we're just so easy on our borders and we make it so easy for people to come here. Well, let's have a look at this second graph then. This shows us the first 6 months of 2011 compared to the first 6 months of 2010. So the later figures are in blue, the year before is in red, and straight away we can see that in the United States, for example, there has been a sizable increase in the number of asylum applications. In fact, the figures are 34% up in the United States, from 27,000 to 36,000. Germany, 29% up, almost the same proportion, from 15,000 to 20,000, basically. The UK, also up 12%, from 10,865 in the first 6 months of 2010 to 12,175 for the same period the following year. Here in Australia, is it a big issue? Well, I don't think so, because when you look at that graph, we are the only country that's going down. The number of asylum applications was 6,137 in 2010. Down to 4,955, as we've seen, for 2011. That's a 19% drop in the number of asylum applications. It doesn't look, does it, according to these statistics, as though our borders are open and everyone's just abusing the privilege. So let's have a look at some more graphs here. So this graph shows for the second quarter of last year where Afghanistani asylum seekers sought their asylum out of all the countries in the industrialized world. So this excludes Afghanistanis who managed to escape the war in Afghanistan and find themselves in neighboring countries, in refugee camps or whatever, camping on the streets perhaps, whatever they're doing, and perhaps doing it for the rest of their lives. These are the ones who managed to get out and managed to actually seek asylum somewhere in the industrialized world. So it looks like a quarter of them seek asylum in one country. Now, you'd assume, given that we have this huge issue here in Australia with asylum seekers, and so many of them from Afghanistan, that we'd be taking a quarter of the Afghan asylum seekers in the industrialized world, wouldn't you? I mean, clearly, we've got beautiful beaches and a marvelous economy, so this is the country where you'd want to go to. But then, let's have a look at a map of the world. Let's get realistic about this. Here's Afghanistan. To get here, you've got to go through a lot of Southeast Asia. You've got to live in refugee camps in Indonesia, perhaps, before you get the boat over here. A lot of water, and then, of course, a very poor chance of survival. So maybe you'd be nuts to make that journey, which is probably why most Afghan asylum seekers head overland to Europe. A slightly easier journey, it would seem. And therefore, the issue of too many Afghan asylum seekers is perhaps more of an issue for the Europeans than it is for the Australians. So the country where almost a quarter of all Afghans who are seeking asylum, they seek asylum in this one country, and that country is Germany, the economic powerhouse of Europe. Some other wealthy economies as well taking in more than their fair share. Sweden taking 10% of Afghan asylum seekers, Belgium another 10%, Austria 7%. So what about Australia then? What proportion of all Afghan asylum seekers in the second quarter of 2011 sought asylum in Australia? Well, the answer is a very low 4%. Hardly, again, something for us to be concerned about, is it? In fact, all of these figures, the one thing that they have in common as far as Australia is concerned is they really are not worth getting worried about. So when we look at the figures that are in the table in the Telegraph today, we see that Australia has a 50% acceptance rate of refugees from Afghanistan. The UK has 30%. When we actually look at the numbers, and they're pretty small in both cases, so 313 asylum applications in half a year last year, 405 for the UK. It works out, about 120 to 150 accepted refugees in each case. These are small numbers and really not worth worrying about. So that really gives us a few pieces of advice for anyone who wants to write another piece like this. If you fancy yourself as being a writer for the Daily Telegraph, well, we've got a few tips here. The first is make sure you choose your countries carefully. So if you're going to compare Australia with anywhere, choose somewhere like the UK. Obviously, don't choose Germany because the figures are way too big and your comparison isn't going to come out favourably for what you're trying to achieve. Secondly, avoid absolute figures. By showing percentages, you can show a huge difference, whereas in absolute terms, the figures might be so small, no one would be really concerned. Thirdly, ignore external factors. So start talking about how these changes in figures could be the result, or probably are the result, of political decisions here. Nothing, of course, to do with any wars that might be staged around the world. And then finally, of course, assume your readers are pretty stupid for taking in all this sort of stuff. There we are. That's how you do it. That's how you become a writer for the Daily Telegraph.
Balls Radio with Phil Dobby.
That's it for this edition of Balls Radio. See you next time.